People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Yes, unfortunately, instead of getting oil, you get coffee grounds delivered to you when you order oil into that system. So
I want to say thank you again for inviting me. I'm Mary Ruwart. I've been part of the North Carolina Libertarian Party in the past. I was living in Charlotte for 4 years. I'm now in Texas, and I'm really delighted to be able to share with you some of my ideas about how we can increase our success. Those of you who know me for a long time have heard parts of this talk before, know my attitude towards it, but it's worth repeating, especially with what's been going on nationally. So, I'm going to talk about how the Libertarian Party can increase its success, but of course, before we can talk about that, we have to define success. What does it mean? Well, it could mean electing libertarians, although, quite honestly, when the party started, that wasn't the goal. The goal was to get the message out. Electing libertarians would be really good, but there is a problem, and that is that we have majority rule. And what that means is that even Ron Paul, who was in Congress for many terms, really couldn't do more than be a whistleblower for us, letting us know, for example, that the Patriot Act was going to be a really, really bad piece of legislation, and giving us the update on what it actually was. He was not able to pass a lot of legislation that would change the form of government, because as long as we have majority rule, he would have had to get a majority of Congress to pass things that he wanted to see. Now, of course, he was really great in that because he was a whistleblower and because he was a unique libertarian, we got a lot of publicity from him, even though he was running as a Republican. And he did run, of course, in our presidential slot at one time. And he was able to bring in a lot of active people. And when he even campaigned as a Republican in the last couple terms, when he was in Congress, he brought a lot of people in to the libertarian movement. Because our movement's about ideas, it's not really about a party label. And that was great. But electing libertarians, if we wait till we elect a majority of libertarians, we could be in trouble. But the good news is that we can elect the libertarian ideas without necessarily electing libertarians. And that's one of the advantages of running candidates, because they make great advertisements when they bring the libertarian message to the public. There's really not a very good way for the message to get out to the public any better than running candidates. And I know when I was running as candidate, I really enjoyed getting the ideas out. That, to me, to watch people lighten up when they realized what freedom truly was, and they heard the libertarian message, you'd see light bulbs go off in their eyes, and it was just a fantastic, really, way to relate. So these two things are complementary, but my bias is to elect the libertarian ideas, because I don't think we can easily elect enough libertarians to change the culture. But I do believe in running for office, because that's how we get the libertarian ideas out. Now, I think one of the biggest obstacles we face is that we have a libertarian culture, at least for my generation, where most of the libertarians entered the movement because of Ayn Rand. And she was a great storyteller. She did wonderful things in illustrating what would happen if you didn't have the libertarian ideal. And of course, she didn't have the libertarian ideal when she was growing up, because she grew up in communist Russia. So she was a great storyteller for that. But she also had some other ideas which I think maybe don't serve us well and have caused a lot of problems for us in the past. And we've seen the result of this up at National, I think. So what she did is she said, judge and be prepared to be judged. And that created a libertarian culture where we did judge our fellow libertarians and often drove them out of the party. I remember when I went to the 1983 convention, which was my first, I was appalled at how libertarians treated each other. And I decided that I couldn't be in the movement unless I tried to change that. So in subsequent conventions, some of my friends and I ran a unity campaign to try to encourage libertarians to be gentle with their fellow libertarians rather than nasty and drive them out of the party. And for many years, whoever lost the presidential nomination was either driven out of the party or voluntarily left because they really, instead of being complimented for giving us a choice, they were vilified. And if we do that, there's just too few of us. We're never going to get anywhere. So I think we really need to change that aspect of our culture. But the problem is, it's largely unconscious. I don't think people sit and say, well, let's see, Rand said that we should judge and be prepared to be judged, so let's judge our fellow libertarian. Nevertheless, that was clearly embedded in our libertarian culture. And what happens when we are judgmental is it makes us difficult to relate and understand how our fellow libertarian, or even our non-libertarian friends, think about things. And if we don't know how someone thinks about an idea, it's very difficult for us to relate to them enough to be able to change their perspective. And so the first thing we have to do if we want to change the way others think is change the way we ourselves think, and try to understand how to empathize with someone and understand where they come from. So if we can't do that, we can't really show them how liberty brings them the very thing they want. Because most people really want the same thing. They want peace and prosperity. And I think the libertarian ideal takes us there quickly, and certainly better than most other systems. But we're not going to convince anybody of that if we are not able to see things from their point of view so we can address their concerns. And as I mentioned, this conditioning is also very unconscious at times. When I first put out Healing Our World in '92, I remember one of my very first conventions, I don't recall what state it was now, a gentleman came up to me and he said, oh, well, I don't think very much of your book because it's so airy-fairy. And I said, oh, can you point out what exactly you mean by that, and which passages or chapters that give you that impression? And he said, oh, well, no, I can't because I haven't read the book. But so-and-so told me about it. And he didn't seem to realize that instead of acting responsibly and freely and making his own decision, he was relying on somebody else's decision. It was quite clear he did not see that. And of course, we do always, to some extent, rely on our friends to inform us, but to come up to the author of a book and make a statement like that, it shows that there's something unconscious going on that he did not pick up on. And that's why I'm bringing your attention to this judgment thing, because this is something that's embedded in our libertarian culture, and it's often unconscious. And what it does is it causes us to judge the other libertarians in the room oftentimes. Now, I have to say, North Carolina has been, to the best of my knowledge, really not so much in that space as other state parties. And that's really good. But we have to be aware that we do have this unconscious conditioning, especially if we came in through through Ayn Rand, as, like I said, many of my generation did. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can deal with things like that later in the talk. So I want to show you, too, how things like this blind us to the kind of answers that we give to people when we're talking about libertarian ideas. So this is all real life examples here that I'm going to give you, unfortunately. So in the early days of the Libertarian Party, we always got asked, wouldn't the poor starve in the streets in a libertarian country? And one of the first answers that I heard was this first one. Oops, sorry. Maybe, but at least we'd stick to our principles. This was not only a very unsympathetic answer, it really did not, illustrate the libertarian paradigm very well. Well, a few years down the road, we were getting smarter as libertarians and said something like this: the poor would have more in a libertarian society. 2/3 of the money for the welfare budget goes to the middle-class social workers, whereas in a privatized system, that money would be going to the poor and making them better off. And that's why in a libertarian society, the poor would have more. And then, as we progressed in our understanding of our own philosophy, we started saying things like this: poverty, as we know it today, would not exist in a libertarian society, because government wouldn't be destroying jobs, especially for the poor, through licensing laws and minimum wage. So almost everyone could find a job, and the few that couldn't could be taken care of by the many who were employed and prosperous. So these are the kinds of things that evolved as we not only understood our own philosophy and principle, but also in practice. So there's another way we can approach all this, and that is to be aware of how we relate to people. So for example, one of the first things I did as a libertarian is I ran for state rep against an incumbent for 3 different election cycles. And she was a liberal. She wanted to help the poor, so she would, of course, suggest all these programs to help the poor. And I would say, that I really applauded her motives, but I thought that they would not give her the results she wanted because of this and the other thing, and that I'd talk about the libertarian solutions. Excuse me for a minute. Now, what was interesting is that after I'd run against her 3 times, I ran into her in a shopping mall. And she was all eager to talk to me. She said, I just helped vote on a bill to privatize part of our welfare system. And she was so proud of it. Well, this was something that was coming from my interaction with her, and I was really surprised, but of course, excited about that. And she was excited about that. And so by being respectful of my opponent, and yet telling her exactly what I thought would happen if she had her solution and proposed a better solution, and because I was respectful, I did not offend her. She actually kind of thought, hey, this might be a good idea. And she was so enthused about actually activating it because she was in a position to do it. So I think it's really good if we can be gentle with our opponents. I know there are times when maybe that's not possible, but in most cases, it is to some extent. And also, I wanted to let you know, for those of you who don't know much about my background, that I used to I did renovation of apartments, and I did it in a low income area, and I rented apartments many times to people who were on welfare. And what I found out is that our welfare program here in the US isn't actually all that helpful to the poor. What it does is it creates generational poverty. Most of my tenants were people who had been been on welfare for generations, and not the people that we imagine are getting welfare, people down on their luck, for example, or people who are disabled. Yes, there were a few of those, but I would say close to 90% of my tenants were generational welfare recipients that taught their offspring to go after welfare. In fact, I would get young women that were in high school to come and say to me, I'd like to rent your apartment. In a couple of months I'm gonna have this baby. I'll be getting this stipend from the welfare department and I can afford that apartment. And they would drop out of high school, have the baby, and then recognize that that welfare check wasn't gonna cover expenses, really, for a child. So they'd have a second child because then they'd get more money. And then a third child because they get more money, and that's when it stopped in Michigan. So by the time they were of voting age, they had no high school diploma. They were unhappy with their situation. They realized they would never get out of the poverty trap. And so what would happen is they'd try to get a job, but they had 3 children. And since they did not have that diploma, they couldn't get a very good job. They couldn't get child care in their job. So unless they had a relative or friend who would take care of the children, they were stuck forever in that poverty trap. And that is part of what we're actually doing. And because they had no spouse support, because if they got married again, or somebody living with them would support them, the welfare check would be taken away. So it really broke up families. The women found they were better off if they did not have the father of their children living with them. And without that, most of the fathers did not want to help support the children. So it was a big mess. And I had not realized that when I started the process of renting to them. I thought welfare actually did help some people, and I found out it helped very, very few. And that was very disappointing. But I wanted to share that with you because most people don't know that. And when I ran against a congressperson, and I talked about this, he got up and said I was a liar. Of course, I had to say, well, I've got the experience, and this is what I have found. And he couldn't say that because, of course, he didn't deal with these people. He never met them on a day-to-day basis like I do. So here's the thing. I've always known we spent more time infighting than we did sharing our message. I found that out at the 1983 convention where I just wanted to make a point. I wanted to suggest that in the next go-around, not for the 84 election, but the next one, that we run a woman at the top of the ticket. And my thinking was we'd get publicity. I didn't know there was a ban on publicity for the Libertarian Party at that time. I was young and naive. But I was told by a Texas delegate, actually, that the only way that I could get that message out was if I ran for president so that I could speak about that, because that's the only people that got paid attention to at a presidential nominating convention, or so I was told. So I did run, and because I ran, I was taken seriously, which I didn't expect. And so I saw up close and personal what happens at the top of our ticket. And I was very disappointed because I saw libertarians breaking their promises to other libertarians. And I saw libertarians kind of beating up emotionally on other libertarians and driving them out of the party. And I knew I could not stay if I didn't try to change that culture. And so for the next few conventions, friends and myself ran unity campaigns, so much so that when Ron Paul got the nomination in '88, instead of driving Russell Means out of the party, we applauded him. And our nominee joked that he got more applause than he did, which I felt was kind of a victory. But you know, things still have been tough in our party because we have this culture, this unconscious culture of judging. And it's not that we shouldn't have our opinions about things, of course we should. But when we beat up on our fellow libertarian, it's just as bad as if we beat up on the people we're trying to bring into the movement. In fact, maybe it's worse because there's so few of us. And if we drive people away for a disagreement rather than having a debate about it and learning what the other person thinks, then we're not only really getting rid of some of our biggest assets, but we aren't availing ourselves of the opportunity to hear another viewpoint. Because other viewpoints are gonna come up when we talk to the public too, and we need to know how to address them. And we don't if we don't practice with our own. So, I was on the Judicial Committee for a couple terms, in fairly recent years. And the cases that came before us were of different states where they had two factions fighting for control of the party, and both factions thought they were the elected committees for those states. And that was really discouraging to see that our Judicial Committee had to spend time trying to figure out who was the right party. I mean, we're fighting among ourselves so much that libertarians were suing other libertarians. And on the LNC, had 3 terms on the LNC, it was kind of similar. Not that libertarians were suing other libertarians, but there's definitely a struggle for power. And this was always our challenge, being a libertarian party, is to stay the party of principle and also to have teamwork and work together so that we could, in fact, influence the public. But we were too busy fighting each other because it's just easier. At least that was my conclusion. It's easier to fight with our own than to actually go out and face the beast and the conditioning that most of the public has. It's easier to fight our own over some part of principle than it is to try to convince the public that freedom is a good thing and what freedom is, what it really means. So what can we do? Obviously, I think we should be respectful of those we disagree with. We shouldn't back down on our principles. We should still maintain them. And if we don't agree, we need to speak up. But I don't know, I wish I had a magic bullet to say, this is the way we can do that. Maybe we should have more debates. I remember when I was in the early days of the party, we spent a lot of time in our county conventions talking about the different issues. In fact, we used the Liberty International pamphlets. At that time, we were known as the International Society for Individual Liberty. We used those 36 issue pamphlets to educate ourselves. So we had big debates about whether what was in the pamphlet was actually the libertarian position, how it related to the non-aggression principle. And so what happened is, we were very educated by the time we became candidates in all these issues. Today, sometimes I listen to libertarian candidates and I feel like they've never heard of the non-aggression principle. And that's pretty scary, because that's where the passion comes in. When I first learned about the libertarian philosophy, I was very excited about it. And a lot of libertarians in the ensuing years have come up to me and said, well, I'm not sure I'm happy that I heard about the libertarian message because, all my friends and relatives think I'm crazy. It's caused some rifts in my family. And so I've asked them, well, if you could turn back the clock, would you rather not know? Not one of them have said that they would turn back the clock and not know. And I think that's because, in a way, the libertarian philosophy creates an elevation of consciousness. Basically, we are accepting the principle that initiation of force to get our way is not the way to go. It does not serve us, either as a society or as individuals. And this is a very special thing, and I think the people who were concerned about losing their family and friends because they were libertarians, and that's a big concern, I understand it. But what I think they didn't really pick up on until I asked them the question was that this knowledge, even though it creates some distress among family and friends, also has a benefit above the idea of, well, above the idea of that it's more important to know truth and feel that elevation of consciousness as a result than it is to maintain family and friends and know falsehood. Not sure why that is, but that seems to be the case. So, I think one of the things we could do is have more discussion about issues so that our candidates are always prepared to go out and talk to the public and relate it to our principles. I don't know if moderated debates is the way to go, but I throw that out there as something to think about and maybe incorporate somehow in your conferences, conventions, or county groups. And there's always a question of how big our tent should be. One of the things that I've heard in the past is that if we bring in people who don't know everything about the libertarian philosophy, but know one or two things, that they will get pickled, so to speak, by the experienced libertarians who can help them with the other issues. And I think that actually happened in the early days of the party. I don't know how much it happens today. As I said, my perception, right or wrong, is that our candidates often don't know much about the non-aggression principle, or at least are hesitant to express it in a campaign. And then, of course, the other part of that is, on the other hand, people come in, if we have a big influx of people, and they are not really amenable to the libertarian philosophy, are we going to have a problem with not being the party of principle anymore? Do we need a purity test? Personally, I don't think so, but that is another question. And I want to address this last one, which I mentioned a little earlier. Can we remain the party of principle as we grow? In the 1980s, there was a strategic session that the LNC paid a lot of money for. They invited people, I was one of them, to talk about a strategy of how we should proceed. The most contentious thing, we had like 12 different ways we could go on different things. The most contentious thing was this: can we remain the party of principle as we grow? There was a big faction among the attendees, I think there maybe were like 40 attendees, who did not want to have this as one of our strategies. They said we couldn't measure it. I believe we can. We can look at our presidential candidate, we can look at other candidates. At that time, there weren't many candidates. We could have surveyed them against the platform just to see if we were lining up. But I think the idea here was, this was the beginning of the ends justify the means. In other words, if our principles are turning people off, they did not want to see them used in our campaigns. And this is, what happens. This is the challenge of being a party, is that we get so fixated sometimes on winning at any cost that we are willing to sacrifice our principles. And if we do that, it won't matter if we get elected, because if we're not principled, we won't be changing anything. At least that's my opinion. So there are things that I really feel shouldn't be happening in the party. We have a lot of candidates that want to be Republican light when running for office. My thought is that if we position ourselves as Republican light, why should people vote for us? The passion won't be there. And believe me, in the early days, there was a lot of passion, and I think there still is, of course, but there's that. I think there's less excitement about Republican light. And why shouldn't people vote Republican if, you know, they're comparing Republican light to Republican, because the Republicans are, you know, they're gonna win some races. Republican light, calling themselves libertarians, maybe not. And then there are people in our party who want to win no matter what the cost, because their goal is power. And that's sad, but there are, at least in my opinion, there are folks like that. And, you know, back in the days, the earlier days of the party, we didn't accept matching funds for our presidential campaign. Well, we never qualified for a while until Andre Maru. He tried really hard to qualify, but he surveyed his constituents to see, should we accept matching funds? So at least he asked around, and the answer was no for most people. So he did not accept them, but down the road, that has changed. And is this a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I think there's arguments both sides, but I used to say, because people would say, how do we know that libertarians are different? How do we know you're not gonna act just like everyone else? And I used to say, well, you know, because we don't accept matching funds. We don't accept taxpayer funds for our conventions. We don't accept them for our candidates. So we're not gonna take your money when we win, if we don't take it before we win. And that was pretty convincing to most people. I can't say that anymore, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I'm not gonna get into the debate on that. I'm just pointing out that there are certain things that we did in the past that seem to really be important to people. But whatever the issue, I think we can be respectful with each other, speak truthfully about harms. You know, in my cultural family conditioning, you know, we tended not to elaborate on bad things. But there are times when you have to speak up and say, hey, you know, this isn't in alignment with our principles, at least in my opinion. So that's something we do need to do. We do need to speak up, but we can be respectful about it. And, you know, when we speak about things, whatever they are, in our conventions, in our party, with each other, you know, we're setting the example, especially if we've been in the party for a while, especially if we hold an office. You know, we are giving an example to the new people that come in. And if we're contentious and disrespectful, then that's the example they're going to learn. That is the example they're going to emulate. So it's really important, I think, for us to try really hard to set a standard that's going to allow us to cooperate as opposed to fighting with each other. And it's a delicate balance because sometimes, like I say, you have to speak the truth also. If something is going to harm the party, you have to speak out. So it's a very delicate balance. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this unconscious conditioning that I've mentioned a couple times. So, Liberty International has this emotional and mental freedom course, and we have these flyers that are on the table with myself and Thomas Hill. And basically, this course was just done last month. We got a lot of great feedback. And what we tried to do in this course is point out that we all have cultural conditioning from our peer group, our family, you know, and of course, as libertarians, we have a libertarian culture, so we have things there. And a lot of this is unconscious. And we did exercises to bring it into our conscious awareness. And then if we didn't like it, to change it. I don't think there's anything else like this going on right now in the libertarian movement in a formal way. But we're going to have this course again in November because we got such good feedback on it from this month and some good ideas of how to make it better. So I'm really excited that we're going to be giving it again. I'll be speaking. Thomas Hill is a speaker. We have Jeff Crawford, originally from Texas, then he went to Hawaii, came back to Texas. And we have one of our Polish staff members, Agnieszka Placki, and And we had a great, really a very tight and grateful course. I mean, I was very impressed by the feedback we got. We had homework, and now what we're going to do is do more exercises, basically with the speakers, because that was what was requested. So this is going to be very exciting. If this kind of thing appeals to you at all, I want to let you know that if you've attended this convention, if you've registered for this convention, you're going to be getting an email from us that's going to give you a code for 20% off. So this is a special gift to North Carolina convention attendees. And if this is something that you think you'd like to learn more about, it does help you really in all kinds of situations to identify things that right now you may be just reacting to without realizing it. So if that, like I said, if that interests you, pick up a flyer if you wish, and I'll be in touch with your convention to make sure that we can get an email out to each of you and let you know what the code is and how to sign up. There actually is a way on this, it's got a QR code, you can go there and get on the waiting list. We had a little difficulty with that when we tried it, so if you have problems, just come and see me and we'll make sure that you, like I said, get a coupon for this. So basically that's it on my talk, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Before I do, I got a question last night that I really didn't think I had an answer to, but then when I went back to my room, I remembered, so I want to share that with you now. As you recall, I talked about the vaccine schedule that the CDC had, and I got a question about Dr. Paul Thomas's study and what, if anything, was done to adjust for the educational status of the parents. And I think I said, oh, was that your question? Yeah, okay.
I do all the good ones.
Okay, so anyhow, I said I didn't think we did that, but actually, when I went back to my room, I remembered, wait a minute, they did have something. It was so unusual, I didn't think of it in response to that question. But all the data that you saw from Paul Thomas's study came from patients that were born into his practice. That's important because what that means, since these babies were born into his practice, that the parents of that baby got the informed consent that he gave for all vaccines. So in other words, all of his patient parents received training, if you will, or what we would call informed consent. So they received a lot of education and detail. So all of them were presumably educated more or less the same way. So in a way that did adjust for that, and I just wanted to point that out because I didn't recall that the other day. And now I'm open to questions on this talk.
Come on, there we go.
Dr. Ruwart, my question for you is, how do we heal the divide amongst the people that did not support the presidential campaign that Chase ran? For more established libertarians, we realize that the messaging that comes from the presidential campaigns is so important for developing future libertarians, and the fact that, you know, the earth got salted, money was stolen, money was given to the RFK campaign, you know, baby daddy's got money. How do we heal that divide with the people that still support that faction and turn the page on that?
That's an excellent question. And actually, the reason I'm giving this particular talk and discussions with your communications director, this is the kind of thing he felt might spark just that consideration. And of course, the answer is, I'm going to be real straight with you. I haven't been totally involved with that whole situation. I don't know the players, so I can only give you my armchair. This is something that's going to require, I think, approaching the people who were in that faction and actually saying, how can we heal this? That's what I think. I think you're going to have dialogue. And I don't know that everyone is going to stay in the party. that, from that faction, I don't know that you can do a complete healing, but I do believe if you talk one-on-one with people, I think you can smooth that over, I really do. But don't expect it to be 100%. Just go with the flow and do what you can. And if you all want to be ambassadors to that, I think it's the most powerful thing that could happen around that. That's not gonna happen at national level. I mean, the LNC is not going to be able to do that. It's gonna be up to people like yourself who have been involved with what's, been happening, know the terrain, so to speak, know the players, and are willing to approach them. And I can't think of anything more important right now than doing that, because we are in a really bad place. We've really come down in membership and money. We've got to rebuild. And we need to offer the olive branch to those who are not going to resurrect this fiasco again, but those who say, yeah, this didn't work out the way we expected. And we'd like to make it better. And we'd like to change things. And it'll be up to you, each of you who get engaged in this, to really decide if you feel that the people who you're talking to are really dedicated to healing the rift too. Because, like I said, you have to tell it as it is. And you just have to do the best you can. It's really hard to know anyone perfectly. But I think if we approach with respect and offer the olive branch, you're gonna get more people than if you scold them and say, look what you've done, this is horrible. We've just gotta mend that fence somehow. That's my opinion, and for what it's worth.
Thank you. Yes, I enjoyed your anecdote about meeting your former competitor and hearing about their attitude on a policy change. I wonder how that relationship might have developed, or if there are any other examples of that. And also in Texas, have you had libertarians running for U.S. Senate, and how have those campaigns gone for them?
Yes, well, we've been very fortunate in Texas for a while. We ran a lot of candidates. We were often the top party for running candidates, but right now we're fighting battles with the state because they didn't like that part. So what they've done is they've made huge filing fees for our candidates, and we're currently trying to fight that. Some of our candidates are paying it, some didn't pay it and still were allowed to run. But it's going to come down to, well, I know we're suing, but I don't know, we don't have an outcome yet as far as I know.
So is the filing fee 1% of the salary, or is it more than that?
I don't know how they calculated it, but it was pretty huge. I heard numbers of like $2,500 to $5,000.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's more.
that, when you think of a libertarian campaign, in some cases, especially for local races, that's all you've got. So that's pretty bad. And again, I will say this, I haven't kept up with the details lately, so things may have changed, but that's my understanding as of the moment. Yes.
Would the flyers for the Liberty International be on the table with your books?
Oh, with this?
You said there were other flyers?
Yes, just this flyer is on the table.
Okay.
So just pick one up, we have plenty.
Just clarifying question.
Sure, no problem. Anything else?
Yeah, I'll ask real quick. So we get pushed to run locally and to try to get people involved in local campaigns. And that's usually something where you can't get passionate about it, in the sense that it's just not big, exciting, national, change the world type stuff. How do you get people to remain engaged for what is sometimes 3 or 4 years and build the relationships with non-libertarians, city councils and stuff, so you can get that incremental change, get planning commission boards and city councils and zoning reform and all the things that actually change your community, but it's kind of hard to run out there and say, hey, this is so amazing that we've, you know, gotten rid of parking minimums, for example, or what have you, whatever you want to use in as an example. How do you get people engaged at that level? Because that usually doesn't draw people in, because it is kind of boring.
That's a good point. And in Kalamazoo, we actually had an issue that was big enough that we could run on it. For example, we ran for city commission. We had 4 libertarians and 1 incumbent who was, I think you'd call him a small L libertarian. And it was supposed to be nonpartisan, but the media called us libertarians to discredit us. And what we did is we doorbelled, and when we doorbelled, we found out that we really had hit an important part, because we had a lot of elderly people living in some of the neighborhoods that were part of our district, and saying to us, we paid off our mortgage, but now our property taxes are bigger than our mortgage ever was, and we're gonna have to move instead of being able to live in our home. So we started calling ourselves the taxpayer protection slate. And that was a big issue, and that's why everybody ran as a slate. So there were 5 slates. We came in second after the incumbents, which was pretty remarkable for the first run for libertarians in that area. And then what happened is the city of Kalamazoo proposed a rail consolidation project in this small town. They wanted to have like overpasses and things that would cost so much that it would be the biggest tax increase that the city had ever had. And I actually went to a meeting with some of my fellow libertarians that were against this rail consolidation. And a gentleman came up to me and put $200 in my fist, and this is in the 80s, okay? He hadn't said a word yet, and then he said, Dr. Ruwart, my brother and I have a bicycle shop. And this rail consolidation is going to take it by eminent domain. And I'm giving you this money because I know you're on our side because you are a libertarian.
Mhm.
That's how successful we were in getting the message out, because the media called us libertarians. We had to tell the public what that meant. So we actually, as part of the coalition, were able to stop the rail consolidation. That of course, triggered the ability to really do a lot of good things in front of the city commission. And if you have an issue like that, then it makes it easier, obviously. But I would pick 1 or 2 issues, and you know, even in small towns, 1 or 2 issues can hurt a lot of people. And get those people behind you and tell their story. And then you, the libertarians, are trying to save people that are being attacked by government. This is a very good story. And you know, it's what people want to see. They want to vote for heroes. They want to vote for people that are trying to protect them. Just like the taxpayers that were having to leave their houses. They wanted us to protect them, you know, and the people who were fighting rail consolidation, eminent domain, they wanted us to help them. And that's something that you can find out in your community, you know, who is being hurt. So that would be my strategy. And you can find somebody. Because zoning, you know, really can hurt a lot of people too. There's someone in the back.
I have a question. Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Matthew Portman again. I'm going to give quick context with my question. When I was running for office as a state-level House candidate against 2 other people, one of the lessons I learned from it personally was that I had more influence than I expected. I ended up being, a small exaggeration, the key person to cause for a city bond referendum to fail, saving people property tax money. And I was hoping to achieve this, but I really didn't think that I could, like, deep down. And so it demonstrated that by getting people to get out the vote, that I had a powerful influence in that way. And so I like what you had to say about the importance of getting along with your opponents, but then also the importance of really using your platform as a candidate to spread ideas. But it feels to me that perhaps maybe these can be slightly contradictory. When I was running, I had a hard time balancing respect for my opponents, which they deserve, but then also trying to motivate the voters by demonstrating how different I was and how upset I was by their policies and their conduct, which I often found very worthy of criticism. So, with all those things in mind, my question to you is, how would you evaluate those two things, the importance of, say, your messaging in motivating people to get out the vote, and then also of perhaps influencing the candidates who are likely to win the election? Because as you can see, I was able to talk on the side about the bond, even though that wasn't quite what I was running for. And I had, in my case, I was kind of lucky, but I had a very deep influence. And so I feel that in that way, there's more than just caring about what your opponents are doing. So in that way, maybe arguably, it wasn't so important that I got my opponents to agree with me and to accept some of my ideas. But maybe you're right that it is better to have somebody approach you at the grocery store and say, I was thinking about you when I made a reform to the welfare.
Well, you know, not everybody, every one of your opponents is going to see things your way, no matter how respectful you are and how many good ideas you have. This person was open-minded, and I actually, until she approached me, after I ran against her, I did not realize how much she'd been listening. So you never really know. But when you are talking to your opponent in a respectful way, they're not the only ones that are hearing you. Your audience is hearing you. And that's really important, because most people are not excited about having a candidate who is going to beat up on the other candidate. That usually is a losing strategy, at least that's been my experience. So what you're doing is you're telling your audience, hey, I appreciate the motive of my opponent, and so they, oh, wow, because the opponent oftentimes is beating up on you. So you've elevated yourself in the eyes of your listeners by being the better man, or the better woman, as the case might be, but in your case, the better man. And open to listening and giving another perspective. So you're not just saying, well, I don't really agree with you, here's a better solution. And if you're handling it well, then the other person has to make an argument back. And I'll tell you one thing about Democrats and Republicans, they are not used to having to do that. I mean, I rarely had an opponent that could actually make a really powerful argument against anything I said. So they had to say that I was a liar or something else, which made them look bad, especially when I had the experience and they didn't. Like in the landlord case that we talked about. So, you're playing to your audience, to the voters, as well as your opponent. So if your opponent doesn't go along with you, okay, your voters will. And they did that with you. They listened to you. And you made change. Without electing anybody.
Okay.
Anything else? Well, if not, I just wanted to again thank the North Carolina Libertarian Party for inviting me. I always love coming here if I can, and I want to really say I consider you guys my family away from home. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Like, I can't take full credit for that.
Oh, thank you. You saved it. It was amazing. Paul.
Hey everyone, I just want to make a very quick correction. It wasn't my effort alone, by the way, that got the bond to fail. Because I think it helped quite a bit and said that Mike Ross ran a really great campaign. And that probably likewise, as well as all the other candidates in my area, the voters might have seen helped to inspire people to come out and vote. So it wasn't me alone. But I will say, neither of my opponents were against the bond. I was the only person running in my city. None of the city councilmen were against it either. And in the way that I made the difference between like a tie vote and the big percentage of fail.